What's happening, everybody? Justin, Bridgewater's finest on YouTube, Blockbuster_guy on Twitter. I got my Halifax Mooseheads cap on, and who's ready to talk some NHL prospects in mid-September? 3 years ago, the man, the myth, the legend, the person that all sports bloggers and vloggers on YouTube aspire to be, basically, Steve Dangle, came up with a really interesting way to rank prospective prospects. Dangle came up with the prospect pyramid. So essentially, rather than ranking a team's prospects 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and like, well, why isn't this guy ranked 10th? He should be ranked 21st. Why isn't this guy ranked 4th? He should be 5th, 4th, blah, blah, blah. All the arguments that go along with a team's prospect list. Dangle basically said, let's put them into tiers. Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, Tier 4. Is this player better than this player? I don't care. They're basically equal. Let's put them in Tier 3. It's just a great, non-argumentative, or certainly less argumentative way to rank prospects. I loved it from the first second that I saw it, and I said, at some point, I'm going to tackle the Montreal Canadiens prospect system and do one like this. Now, in saying that, we got to say a couple of things. First of all, that Laval team in the AHL was terrible last year. I think they were last place, and everyone brings that up when you talk about Montreal's prospect pool. 99% of our best prospects were not on that Laval team. That was a terrible team at the AHL level last season. It's got maybe one good piece on it in terms of actually a prospect. The rest of them are all AHL gatekeepers, and Montreal fans know that. So just because our AHL team was garbage last season certainly does not mean that our prospect system and our pipeline is garbage. I actually think our pipeline is pretty good. The other thing I want to do is determine exactly and define exactly what I look at as a prospect. To me, a prospect is 23 years old or younger. Once you hit like 24, 25, 26, you kind of know what you are as a hockey player, and I'm sure basically as a professional athlete. So I look at prospects as somebody that's 23, 22, 21, or a teenager. And also I look at a prospect as someone who has not played 40 games in the NHL. Basically, to me, once you play the equivalent of half a season in the NHL, you're an NHL player. Whether you're a fringe NHL player or not, once you've played that, you're basically at least a fringe NHL player. To me, no longer a prospect. Which means when we're talking about Montreal, we're not going to be talking about Drouin, obviously. We're not going to be talking about Max Domi, obviously. Jacob Delarose, not a prospect anymore. Arturi Lehkonen, not a prospect. Victor Mete, played more than 40 games in the NHL last season, not a prospect anymore. And Michael McCarron, also not a prospect. So with all that in mind, let's get to the prospect pyramid. Now you're going to notice I don't have a fancy whiteboard like Steve Dangle does. I don't make that Sportsnet Dangle money. I can't afford to buy a whiteboard. So we're going to use my tried and true, good old-fashioned title cards. Obviously, we're going to start at the top, Tier 1, and sort of the way that Tier 1 is going to be defined versus the way it was almost defined in terms of this pyramid. Originally, I was going to use Tier 1 simply to answer the question, who is our best prospect? Gun to my head, I can only pick one. Who is our best prospect? So originally, Jesperi Kotkaniemi was going to be in this tier as the only Tier 1 player as our best prospect. That's not the way Tier 1 was handled originally. When Dangle did the first prospect pyramid for the Leafs, Tier 1 is like, do you have a player that projects to be like a franchise player, like an all-NHL player, a Connor McDavid level, a Jack Eichel level, a Nathan MacKinnon, or even a Jonathan Drouin level when they originally came into the league? When Dangle did the first pyramid, they did. His name was Austin Matthews. Remember, he scored 4 goals in his first NHL game. Ultimately, I settled on taking that first tier the same way that Dangle did, because it's like, okay, I could say that like, oh, Kotkaniemi is a Tier 1 player because he's our best prospect. I think Kotkaniemi is going to be an excellent NHL player, very good NHL player, good two-way center. Maybe he projects and becomes a first-line center for Montreal. Who knows? He's not Austin Matthews. He's not Connor McDavid. He's not Jack Eichel. He's not Nathan MacKinnon when they came into the league. He's not that caliber of a player. So, for the Montreal Canadiens in Tier 1, we don't have anybody. I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing. I don't think you have to have a projected franchise player in your system at all times. We've got very good prospects. We just don't have that. So instead of using tier 1 to answer the question of who is our best prospect, gun to my head, gotta pick one, I'm going to use tier 2 to answer that question, but change it up a little bit. I'm going to use tier 2 to answer the question, who's our best prospect? I'm not going to force myself to pick one. Who can make a case as our best prospect? For the Montreal Canadiens, in my opinion, we have 5 players that currently sit in tier 2 who could all make a case as being our best prospect. Those prospects include Noah Juulsen, Nick Suzuki, Alexandre Alain, Jake Evans, and the aforementioned Jesperi Kotkaniemi. Noah Juulsen played 23 games at the NHL level last season. I think he might have only recorded 1 point or something like that, but the point production is not quite what matters on a bad hockey team. Juulsen did not look out of place to me. So at a young age, I think he's already that top 6 defenseman. Could play on the third pair. I don't think he's going to go any higher than that, certainly not this season. But I mean, he's a guy that you can put on your third pair and you don't have to feel like he's out of place. He didn't look out of place to me last season. That's why I think he could make a case as our best prospect. Recently acquired Nick Suzuki makes me very, very excited as a Montreal fan. Granted, he's not probably Vegas's best prospect. I would say that's probably Cody Glass. But we got a really, really good, we got like an A prospect in that Pacioretty trade. Nick Suzuki at the CHL level last season was 1.5 points per game. And it wasn't like he only played 20 or 30 games. He played almost a full season. I think he played 75 games. Alexandre Alain is kind of in the same boat. Played at the same level. Played in the CHL last season. 87 games. Was like 1.3 points per player. Far better than 1 point per game player. Now look, in saying this, CHL success does not always translate into NHL success. Sometimes it just doesn't. We've seen a ton of elite players at the CHL and at the junior level that then come to the NHL and for whatever reason it just doesn't translate. So I'm not saying that like he's a 1.5 point player in the CHL and that guarantees he'll be a 60-point player in the NHL. No, it definitely doesn't. Sometimes it does mean that. Sometimes it means that they're better than a 60-point player in the NHL. But as of right now, Alexandre Alain, as far as I'm concerned, could make a case as being our best prospect based on what he's done at the CHL level. Jake Evans had that unfortunate injury that, by the way, was not a dirty play whatsoever. I think that was in the Habs Sens rookie game. And it was not a dirty play whatsoever. The player for the Sens made the play. He's trying to protect the blue line, make a play at the blue line, stand the guy up at the blue line. Evans just took a terrible fall and got a concussion. And I feel terrible about that. I hope he'll be all right. This is a guy that at the NCAA level last season, so playing against older talent, arguably better talent, more developed talent, playing against that caliber of talent, 40 games last season, he was better than 1 point a game at the NCAA level. That's something that makes me very excited. He's got versatility. He can play up the middle. He can play on the wing. Probably better on the wing as far as, just the little bit that I got to see him. And then finally, of course, Kotkaniemi. We took him number 3 overall in this past draft. He plays over in Finland, obviously, and I think that's probably where he'll wind up going again this season. But I mean, he's playing in Finland, playing against men in a lot of cases. 84 games in Finland last season was better than 0.5 point a game against men. Time, of course, will tell, but he is most definitely in the second tier of prospects. The third tier I look at as basically fringe NHL talent and what could be fringe NHL talent even if they stepped into that level right now. You're talking guys that might come up for a few games, have to pass through waivers and go back down. Guys that are up and down guys but could slot into the lineup. The Montreal Canadiens, in my opinion, have 6 players that currently sit as tier 3 prospects. Those are Hunter Shinkaruk, Nikita Scherbak, Daniel Audette, Will Bitton, Hayden Verbeek, and Michael Pezzetta. Hunter Shinkaruk was just acquired from the Calgary Flames in exchange, I believe, straight up for Kirby Reichel. So that was kind of an interesting trade to me. It seems like such a lateral move. Maybe it makes both teams better. Maybe it is just exactly the same. But he's going to be one of those guys that if there's an injury at a forward position, I mean, he plays up the middle, he plays the wing, you can put him basically anywhere. So if there's an injury, he could be somebody that gets called up to be the 13th or 14th forward, or maybe even slot into the lineup here or there. Nikita Scherbak, kind of the same story. Exclusively plays the right side, which I think between the two, our right side is probably a little bit stronger maybe than the left side is. So Scherbak played 29 games at the NHL level last season. Was that, again, point every 4 games type of player. A little more experience, obviously, from last season than Shinkarik. Still very much a prospect as far as I'm concerned, and one that I imagine will probably make the opening night lineup, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if they were kind of just up and down. Daniel Audette, I think, is the one prospect in the AHL system that is the one to actually be at least moderately excited about. Like, he did play on that Laval team last season, about a half point a game player at the AHL level in 56 games. So somebody that certainly belongs in that level is like, doesn't strike me as a player that like, geez, he doesn't even deserve to be in the AHL kind of thing. But that's somebody that if you were really in a pinch at the center position, you could pull him up. He probably wouldn't slot into your lineup unless things were dire, but he's a guy that you could see come up and down throughout the season. Then we go to a trio of centers at the junior level, all played in the CHL last season. Will Bitton, Hayden Verbeek, and Michael Pezzetta. They're just not those tier 2 players. They don't perform like a Jake Evans, or they don't perform like an Alexandre Alain or Nick Suzuki at the CHL level. They're not that level of player. All of them did very well last season. Will Bitton, 0.87 points per game in 87 games in the CHL. Very similar number for Hayden Verbeek. It was actually the same point per game pace, 0.87. Played a few fewer games, only played 78 games. Michael Pezzetta was about a 3/4 of a point per game player. So just not on that tier 2 level. They're not that level of prospect, but they're most certainly that level of prospect. And again, there's a great argument. Who's the better prospect? Is it Will Bitton? Is it Hayden Verbeek? Who cares? They're basically equivalent, so just put them in the same tier. That's where it saves a lot of arguing time. Now we move to Tier 4, and this tier I affectionately name the AHL Gatekeepers. So these are basically prospects that certainly aren't the Tier 1 or Tier 2. They're not even on that Tier 3 level that we just talked about. The Montreal Canadiens, in my opinion, have 8 players that fit the mold as being a Tier 4 prospect. They include Brett Lernout, Renat Valiev, Antoine Waked, Michael McNiven, Jeremiah Addison, Lucas Videmo, Michael Moravchik, and David Sklenika. Lernout and Valiev are both players that have some NHL experience prior in their careers. Lernout has played 21 games at the NHL level, I believe has a single point in 21 games. Renat Valiev has played 12 games at the NHL level and has 0. So, these are players that are not really NHL players. If you put them in a bottom pairing, they're both defensemen, by the way. You put them in a bottom pairing, they're just going to look out of place. They're not really that they deserve to be there. Waked, McNiven, and Addison all played on that Laval team from last season, and the numbers certainly reflect that. Waked, 63 games in the AHL last season, about a point, less than a point actually, every 5 games. McNiven, terrible results in the AHL last season. He's an ECHL goaltender, let's be perfectly honest. Addison, sort of the same deal. He only played 6 games actually at the AHL level. I think he had 1 point in 6 games. Videmo, I almost moved up into Tier 3. That was a really close one for me because he actually performed. He plays in Sweden. He plays across the forward positions. You can slot him on either side of the wing or up the middle. And in 54 games in Sweden was almost a half point a game player. So I almost moved him up. I think he is one that you could probably slot up into Tier 3, but I felt weird about there being more players in Tier 3 than in Tier 4. That feels like the pyramid's going to collapse. So I didn't do it that way. I took Videmo, put him down in Tier 4. He's going to be a player to watch. Maybe he makes the move over to the AHL team this season, see what he does at that level. He could very easily pop up into Tier 3 if I do this again next season. Moravchik and Sklenika both play in the Czech Republic. They're both defensemen, both played over 75 games last season. Moravchik, a little bit better on the point-producing side of things, about a point every 3 games. They're both players that, again, I need to see what they're going to do at the AHL level before I would really be able to make a call about what kind of prospect they really are. So maybe it might be a little too soon to tell on those players, but if those three, Videmo and the two defensemen, move over to the AHL team this season, A, I think the AHL team will be better, and B, it'll be interesting to see what they do at that level of competition. Now we move down to Tier 5, and Tier 5 is my too soon to tell tier. So this is basically players that have been drafted in the last couple of seasons, or even this most recent draft, but ones that haven't actually signed a standard player contract yet. Right now they're sitting as like reserves. We own their rights, but we haven't actually signed them. They're very young. Basically in this tier, I wanted to look at players that were like taken in the first 3 rounds. So obviously players that would come in with some kind of anticipation around them, or players that based on how they've performed are kind of exceptions to that rule. So in the too soon to tell Tier 5 of the Montreal Canadiens, in my opinion, we have 7 players. We are looking at Cole Fonstad, Alan McShane, Cameron Hillis, Cale Fleury, Ryan Poehling, Caden Primo, and Jesse Ylonen. Fonstad, McShane, Hillis, and Fleury all play at the CHL level, are still currently unsigned at this point. Fonstad, 5th round pick, was taken 128th overall, but in 79 games is essentially a point-a-game player right now at the CHL level. It's just too soon to tell for me because, again, we haven't signed him to a standard player contract, that we haven't hit that level with him yet. But he certainly performed at the CHL level, could even move up maybe to be that Tier 2 type of player, or even a Tier 3 type. Will certainly be moving up the pyramid at some point, just a little too soon to tell on him. McShane and Hillis are both centers at the CHL level. McShane, a little more experienced, played 72 games last season, whereas Hillis only played 66. They're both essentially point-a-game players, just a little bit below that pace, but right around point-a-game players. McShane was a 4th round pick, 97th overall, so just inside the top 100. Hillis, a 3rd round pick, 66th overall, so a little more hype, a little more expectation surrounding that player. Cale Fleury, junior defenseman, also a former 3rd round pick, 87th overall in his draft year, 58 games in the CHL last season, but was 3/4 of a point per game on the back end. That's the kind of defenseman that Montreal needs. Montreal needs an offensively minded, point-producing, puck-moving defenseman. That's what I think Cale Fleury has the potential to be. Probably wouldn't be a Tier 2, but maybe, because he's probably the best point-producing defenseman, I would say, that we've talked about so far in our system. So, I mean, he could be a Tier 2 prospect. Ryan Poehling and Caden Primo both played at the NCAA level last season, and both, as far as I'm concerned, really, really impressive at that level against older competition. Ryan Poehling, 1st round pick of ours, 25th overall at the NCAA level, played 36 games last season, about 0.86 points per game. So he's right in between that point a game and 3/4 of a point per game, right in that area there. And to do that at the NCAA level, I think is very impressive. Jury's still out on him. It's just a little bit too soon, but there's a lot of talk and a lot of hype around Ryan Poehling in our system. And Caden Primo, just the 2nd goaltender we've talked about in our system, but the one that I'm actually excited about. At the NCAA level last season, played 34 games, goals against average under 2, save percentage over 930 at the NCAA level. This guy was a 7th round steal for us. We took him 190th overall. And then to put up those numbers in the NCAA, I will just need to see him do it at the AHL level. This guy might be a Tier 3 prospect. This guy might be a Tier 2 prospect. Who knows? But in the 7th round, absolute steal. And then there's Jesse Ylonen. I believe we just took him in this most recent draft. 2nd round pick, 35th overall. 65 games in Finland last season. Better than a half point a game. Not quite that 3/4 of a point a game player, but better than a half game player in a league playing against men. Want to see how that translates into the AHL level, but a prospect that's worth being excited for. Just a little too soon to tell. And finally, we get to Tier 6. Everybody else. That's the benefit of doing the prospect pyramid. Everybody that qualifies as a prospect who I didn't mention, they're in Tier 6 because it's, who knows at this point? Who knows what they are? They're not a Tier 5. They're not a Tier 4. They're certainly not a Tier 3. It's everybody else. Somebody may emerge from that to become like a tier 4 player next year, or even a tier 3. Who knows? It's not a slight to be put in the everybody else category. It's just, right now, you're everybody else. Show me that you deserve to be higher. There you go, folks. There's my Montreal Canadiens prospect pyramid for the 2018-2019 season. I hope you enjoyed it. The things that you agreed with, things that you didn't agree with, let me know in the comments section below. That's it for me, Justin, Bridgewater's Finest on YouTube, Blockbuster_guy on Twitter, and we'll see you next week when I drop my Montreal Canadiens opening night lineup for the 2018-2019 regular season. And oh boy.